Good morning, everyone. Here is the second part of the presentation on the Great Rock of Naquane for the series Valcamonica Rock Art in 20 minutes. The Methods of Recording by Andrea Arcà. Enjoy, please, this presentation. First of all, I will point out that the Great Rock is located within the Naquane Rock Engraving National Park, which is situated at Capo di Ponte in Valcamonica, Italy. You will be shown the web address of the park, and it should be pointed out that the director is Dr. Maria Giuseppina Ruggero, whom we thank. As we saw in the previous video, I have fully documented and studied the Great Rock of Naquane, performing a complete iconographic tracing, an advanced photographic documentation, many three-dimensional models, figure records, and a well-detailed virtual tour. The Big Rock is like an archaeological site, rich in artifacts to be discovered. These archaeological items must be extracted and highlighted, just like an archaeological dig. On the Naquane Great Rock, I've counted 2043 engraved figures. Here are in this photograph 2 figures from the sector P, the famous duelists next to the labyrinth. Creating contrast. Often in rock art, especially when figures are engraved, they are hardly distinguishable, difficult to see and recognize. They should be highlighted, increasing the contrast between the engraved figure and the surrounding unengraved surface. Above we see a photograph taken with poor lighting conditions. Below the same pictures with much better lighting conditions. The ideal choice for obtaining contrast is the use of grazing light. It is a light source which is oblique with respect to the engraved surface. Such a grazing light can be natural or artificial. Here we see sector T, one of the most interesting areas of the Great Rock, illuminated by 2 lamps arranged on the right and on the left at night, in order to take photographic images with artificial grazing light. When it is best to take photos of the Great Rock of Naquane? The best period falls within the weeks around the winter solstice, between December and January. We see in this photograph figures from sector G, a so-called praying man with big hands. This photograph was taken on December 16, 2016. See how the oblique solar grazing light, the sun is low on the horizon, brings out the figures, creating deeper lines. In essence, the light adds, draws almost, the third dimension, the depths of engraved figures, which, however, are not particularly deep on the Great Rock, as they are simply packed. Thanks to the grazing light, which is in this case the best, the figures appear almost sculpted by the grazing sunlight, as I just said, precisely because the sun is low on the horizon. This is not only the best period of the year to take photographs, but also to visit the Great Rock, and, in general, Naquane National Park. Once obtained, the contrast must be recorded, not only by photographic means, but also by the tracing. The iconographic tracing achieves the same results and has the same purposes of a technical archaeological drawing. In fact, it is necessary to select the most relevant elements and reproduce them graphically, using appropriate symbolism. This same purpose is obtained through cartographic when composing topographic maps. Such maps are not simple aerial or satellite photographs, but they are drawings where the most relevant elements are chosen, selected and reproduced in order to make them immediately visible and functionable for those who, for instance, go on a hike. In the case of rock art, on the other hand, The tracing highlights the most relevant elements for those who need to study the engraved rock, or even simply to locate and observe all the figures and scenes that have been engraved on each surface. The tracing shows more clearly the most important elements, which are the engraved figures, the fractures and the edges of the rock. The most effective tool is that of iconographic tracing. All the engraved figures, but also the natural features of the rock, such as cracks or edges, are reproduced by tracing them on transparent sheets. Here is the upper part of sector P in the southern area of a great rock, partly covered with PVC sheets. To complete this work, there is a need for precision, accuracy, and also experience, as it is necessary to recognize the main themes and types of Valcamonica Rock Art figures. Here is a brief animation to illustrate the tracing method. Starting on the engraved surface, here is a weaving scene of sector P on the Great Rock, with optimal conditions of grazing light. The engraved figures are reproduced by tracing them one by one, along with the natural features of the surface, such as cracks and rock edges. To complete the tracing, initials and annotation are included. To cover the entire surface of a great rock and its 21 engraved sectors, I completed the tracing of 221 sheets of a standard size of 70 for 50 cm. Let's see some examples from sector P and Q, but also from sector G. Here are a few more single sheets in a larger view. As you can see, some have an horizontal orientation, others a vertical orientation. These are the sheets of a sector published so far, A, C, L, H, and T. In black, the engraved figures and their annotations, which were recorded during the tracing directly from the engraved surface. In red, the natural cracks, in blue, the junction marks between the various sheets, and the record of how many minutes were required to trace each sheet. All the sheets were scanned, cleaned with handheld rubbers, and transformed into a clear copy. Here is the sheet L8. The sheets were then placed joined to recompose the whole sector, overlapping them among the edges. Here is the whole of sector L. The assembly of the sheets for each sector is then transformed into a vector drawing. What is a vector drawing? Here, to give an example, we see the figure 90 of sector L. This dear figure in the vector drawing is no longer illustrated by pixels, but by its outline. Just to draw the outline of this figure, 2081 points are needed, which are called curve nodes. Here is the final vector rendering of the iconographic tracing of the sector L of a great rock.
Ecco la realizzazione finale del rilievo iconografico del settore L della grande roccia.
The tracings of all the engraved sectors of a great rock have been assembled together in the overall vector tracing. It is a digital file in 1:2 scale, which original measures 18 meters by 4.5 meters. Of course, photography also played its role. This is one of the numerous folders where the photographic files are stored. Photographic objectives were general, the whole rock, or a large part of it, or the surrounding environment, detailed, scenes, figures, details of some figures, but also photomosaics. Over 6,000 digital shots were taken. Concerning the general wide shots, here is the entire great rock seen from the front and from above. This image is taken from the virtual tour. And more, the northern area of a great rock under the rain, which makes the surface shiny and highlights the engraved figures. Demonstrating Some examples of detailed photos, always under natural or artificial grazing light. We see some deer figures from sector G. They seem almost sculpted by sunlight, even if their depth is not particularly significant. And then, this beautiful human figure, wearing a headdress, a rich helmet. The figure is in fact small, but the photograph was taken at a very close range. We can distinguish almost each packet dot. It is the figure P395, that is the figure 395 of the sector P. And finally, these wonderful figures of small shoals, coming from sector G, the figure G468 and the figure G470, two small shoals together with the associated fire dogs or open fire log supports. To show the great rock within its surrounding environment, I created a series of spherical panel photos, stitching together hundreds of photographs taken at 360 degrees. From 2D to 3D, documenting in the third dimension. The three-dimensional model of the great rock was created using stereophotogrammetry techniques. Various photos were taken from different angles to frame the entire surface, from all perspectives. Let's see the location points for the various photographic shots. After that, the software automatically calculates the measurement of triangulation between the control points that it finds common to two or more photographic shots. We can see, in this animated image, the triangulation model, the so-called mesh. Software reconstructs the three-dimensional metric data and therefore reproduces the solid of the object investigated. Here is the result, a solid that can be moved at will, a useful technique for illustrating the volume of the engraved boulder.
È una tecnica utile per mostrare il volume del masso inciso. Modelli 3D.
Stereophotometric 3D models. In order to obtain greater detail in created three-dimensional models, another three-dimensional modeling technique was experimented with a great rock, stereophotometry. We see in this image, at the moment, the photographic shots were taken on a tripod and with grazing light. Paolo Emilio Bagnoli, of the Pisa University, has compiled the specific software for the creation of these models. On the right, the author of this presentation while taking the photos. But we can ask ourselves, at this point, how does the stereophotometry work? Here is a large handheld anthropomorphic figures from sector G of the Great Rock. The same photographic shot is repeated several times, moving the light source around at each shot, using an artificial grazing light source, rotating it around the tripod. Subsequently, the software reconstructs the three-dimensional metric data, measuring for each pixel the reflected fraction of incident light. Thanks to the variations of the reflected light, it is thus possible to reconstruct the value of the depth of each pixel. And here is the stereophotometric model created from the photos just shown. 4 shots with grazing light. It can be oriented at will, and also allows you to observe the engraved surface extremely closely. We can easily see how the results are far more detailed than the outcome from other types of modeling applications. In fact, one can distinguish not only the individual packet dots of the engraved figures, but also the thinnest glacial striations. The catalogue. The 2043 engraved figures of the Great Rock have each been catalogued separately in database records. Here we see one of many, using the Raro Rock Art Recorder software. It is a database software specifically dedicated to the cataloging of rock art. through the insertions of records of the rocks and the figures. Here is the record of figure number 4 of sector T. There are many fields where you can use the drop-down menu, which contains a series of pre-ordered entries, among which you can make the most appropriate choice, relative to the category, style or category specification, as well as the conditions of the engraved figure. The text fields are long enough to allow a sufficiently detailed description. 3 image fields are available, the first dedicated to the iconographic tracing, the other 2 for the photographic images of each engraved figure. Let's move on to the record of number 7, again from sector T, one of the most interesting figures on the wall of the Great Rock, and one of the greatest figures of a rider in all the Valcamonica Rock Art. The rider figures inside the T sector of the Great Rock are actually 2, large, side by side, and very similar to each other, so as to create the suspicion that they may be mythological, heroic, of divine characters, the so-called twin riders, very well known in Greek, Roman, and Northern European mythology. Let's move on to another interesting record of the T sector, a figure of a small shovel. We see the tracing at the top and the photograph at the bottom. The figure is number 17. With the record number 20, from the T sector, we see a deer figure, with its various descriptive fields and of chronological and stylistic attributions. And finally, let's move on to the last important record of the T sector of the other rider figure. Please notice the accuracy of the figure's execution, the presence of a round shield and of a weapon, which is probably a spear, even if it has not been completed. Therefore, it is an incomplete figure, or the creator wanted to use the horizontal and natural glacial striation as a representation of a weapon's shaft. One of the main features of a rare rock art recorder is the ability to automatically output the catalog of the engraved figures on a HTML file. It is possible to print the catalog of a single rock or of a group of rocks, but also, in a more selective way, to choose a single sector, a single type of figures, for example, all deer, all weapons, all construction figures, or even a single chronology. The Copper Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, but also to make various combinations among these filters. Let's now browse the catalogue of the engraved figures of the Great Rock, produced by the rare rock art recorder software. We don't see it all, we only see the first figures as an example. All the text and image content of the records has been placed into this HTML file. If we click on any image, we may see it enlarged, whether it is the iconographic tracing or a photographic image. All the documentation produced, it has the iconographic tracing, the photographic images, the spherical panoramas, the photomontages, and the three-dimensional models, has now been assembled within the virtual tour of the Great Rock of Naquane, which can be surfed at europreart.net NAQ1, NAQ all uppercase. I warmly invite you to visit this site and these pages, but I also invite you to visit the Great Rock in person at the Naquane Rock Engravings National Park at Capo di Ponte in Valcamonica. Here is the entry page to a virtual visit of the Naquane Great Rock. I remind the address, europreart.net/NAQ1. In the upper bar, some figures taken from the iconographic tracing of the Great Rock, as well as others in the lower bar, where you can see the overall tracing of the north area. Please remember that the Great Rock is inside the Naquane Rock Engravings National Park at Capo di Ponte. Here we see the logo of the ministry and the link to the National Park website. But we must also remember that the entire rock art of Valcamonica is included in the world list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. It was the first Italian site to be included into this list. How do you access the Great Rock virtual tour? Very simple. There is a door. Here the writing appears. Click to open the door. Another message appears. Click again to enter the virtual tour of the Great Rock. This website allows you to navigate on the surface of a Great Rock, just as if you were holding a camera. A word of advice. Pressing the F11 key, you go full screen, and you gain a better view. Moving the mouse, you can change the viewing angle. While operating the mouse wheel, you can zoom in or zoom out. This is not the only viewpoint available. There are others related to the north and south areas. The Naquane Great Rock virtual visit will be displayed in one of the next videos of the series The Rock Art of Valcamonica in 20 minutes. I thank you. Goodbye, see you soon, hopefully during a visit to the Great Rock of Naquane.